There is a moment that Tacitus almost didn't write down. It is 60 CE. The finest soldiers of the most powerful military civilization the Western world has ever produced are standing at the edge of a narrow strait of water, staring across at an island. They are the 14th Legion, veterans of campaigns across Gaul, Germania, and the Balkans. They have faced Germanic war chiefs, Gallic chieftains, and Parthian cavalry. They have never hesitated. Not once. But on that morning, on the shore of what the Romans called the Menai Strait, something happened that Tacitus recorded with an unmistakable edge of discomfort. The soldiers froze, not because of the warriors facing them, not because of any military obstacle. They froze because of what they saw, and more precisely, because of what they felt radiating off a landscape that was old in a way Rome had no category for. On the far shore stood women dressed in black, their hair loose, their hands holding torches that burned even in the gray morning light. Between them, robed figures stood with arms raised toward a sky that had not changed since before Rome was a collection of huts on the banks of the Tiber. And the soldiers, the men who had conquered most of the known world, stood still. What stopped the 14th Legion was the weight of time itself. Tacitus tells us that Gnaeus Julius Agricola had to physically rally his troops, reminding them that a troop of women and fanatics was not worth their fear. They crossed, they killed, they burned the sacred groves that had stood on that island for longer than anyone could remember. But here is the question that Tacitus never quite asks, and that no Roman historian ever answered cleanly. What was it, exactly, that stopped those soldiers? What was the thing that the Roman military machine, which had never failed to reduce any enemy to submission, found itself unable to process at the edge of that Welsh strait? The answer is not what you were taught in school. The answer is not mysticism, not superstition, not the psychological shock of women on a battlefield. The answer is older than that, heavier than that, and far more disturbing to the Roman worldview than any tactical surprise could ever be. What stopped the 14th Legion was the weight of time itself. The accumulated, visible, undeniable evidence of a civilization so old, so sophisticated, and so deeply embedded in the landscape of Britain that the Romans, who prided themselves on being the inheritors and administrators of all human progress, suddenly found themselves standing in the shadow of something that made their own history look like an opening paragraph. This is the story of that civilization, not the Celts, though the Celts are part of it. Not the Druids, though the Druids carried its last living flame. But the thing beneath all of that. The thing that was here before the Iron Age warriors, before the Bell-Beaker migrants who swept across Europe 3,000 years before Caesar was born, before even the first Neolithic farmers who crossed the Channel with their seeds and their livestock and their foreign gods. This is the story of the people who built Stonehenge, who raised the megaliths of Avebury, who engineered the light box at Newgrange with a precision that modern architects respect, who tracked the 18.6-year cycle of the Moon across the landscape of the Outer Hebrides, and encoded that knowledge in stone alignments that still work today, 5,000 years after the last of them died. This is the story the Romans knew and feared and never fully wrote down. And it begins not with a monument, it begins with a flood. Before we can understand what Britain was, we need to understand what Britain is not, and more precisely, what it used to be. Stand on the coast of Norfolk and look east, out across the North Sea toward the Netherlands. The water you are looking at is approximately 40 meters deep, cold, gray, and empty of anything visible from the surface. But underneath, preserved in the anoxic sediment where nothing decays properly, there is a world, a whole lost world. Archaeologists and marine geologists call it Doggerland, and it was not always underwater. 12,000 years ago, that stretch of what is now the North Sea was dry land. Not marginal, inhospitable land, but a vast, rich, biologically productive landscape of river valleys, marshes, forests, and lake systems that extended from what is now eastern England all the way to the coast of modern-day Denmark and the Netherlands. By land area, Doggerland was approximately the size of the modern United Kingdom itself. It was home to some of the most productive ecosystems in Ice Age Europe. Enormous herds of mammoth and reindeer, salmon-rich rivers, waterfowl in numbers that modern ornithologists would find difficult to imagine, and dense deciduous forests regenerating as the climate slowly warmed after the last great glacial maximum. And it was populated, not densely by modern standards, but populated by the direct ancestors of the people who would eventually build Stonehenge. Hunter-gatherers of extraordinary sophistication, the Mesolithic people of northwestern Europe, who moved through this landscape with a knowledge of its resources, its seasonal patterns, and its geography that was the product of tens of thousands of years of accumulated human experience. These were not, it is critical to understand, the grunting, club-wielding primitives of popular imagination. They were people operating at the full cognitive capacity of modern human beings because they were modern human beings, anatomically and neurologically identical to you and to everyone reading or listening to this. The only things they lacked were the accumulated technological artifacts of civilization: writing, metalworking, large-scale agriculture. What they possessed instead was something that is genuinely difficult for modern people to appreciate: an almost incomprehensible depth of empirical knowledge about the natural world, accumulated through direct observation and transmitted through oral tradition across hundreds of generations. They knew the rivers of Doggerland the way a New York attorney knows Manhattan. Not just the streets, but the shortcuts, the seasonal flooding patterns, the places where specific resources concentrated at specific times of year, the subtle landmarks that distinguished one valley from another in fog or snow. They could read weather from cloud formations, predict animal movements from behavioral cues, navigate across featureless landscape using stars, landmarks, and the accumulated geographical knowledge stored in song, story, and memory. They knew the rivers of Doggerland the way a New York attorney knows Manhattan. And then, over a period of several thousand years, the sea took it all. The last great ice age had locked enormous quantities of water in ice sheets across the northern hemisphere. As those ice sheets melted, between roughly 20,000 and 6,000 years before the present, sea levels around the world rose by approximately 120 meters, gradually at first, then with increasing urgency as the ice retreated. The rivers of Doggerland began to flood their banks. The lake systems expanded, merged, became seas. The marshlands drowned. The forests died, their roots submerged, their trunks preserved in the cold, anaerobic mud that now rests under the North Sea, sometimes dragged up by trawlers in the form of what fishermen call moorlog, dark, peat-like material from an ancient landscape that no living person has ever walked. Around 6,200 BCE, a catastrophic event accelerated the process. A submarine landslide off the coast of what is now Norway, the Storegga Slide, triggered a mega tsunami that sent waves up to 20 meters high, crashing across the remaining exposed land of Doggerland. This event, preserved in the geological record as a distinct layer of marine sediment found far inland across Scotland and Scandinavia, may have been the single most catastrophic natural disaster to affect northwestern Europe in the entire period of human habitation. The people who survived moved west. They moved to the higher ground that would become the British Isles. They moved to the coastal cliffs and upland plateaus of what would become Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and England. And they carried with them something that the sea could not drown: their knowledge, their stories, their understanding of the world and their place in it. Their rituals connecting the living to the dead, the present moment to the deep well of accumulated ancestral experience. These were the first Britons, not the Romans, not the Anglo-Saxons, not even the Celts. The first Britons were the refugee survivors of a drowned world, carrying the cultural inheritance of a civilization that the North Sea now covers, and they brought that inheritance to an island that was becoming, for the first time in human experience, genuinely isolated from the continental mainland. By around 6,500 BCE, the last land connection between Britain and the continent was submerged. Britain was an island, and what happened to its people in that isolation over the following millennia is one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire history of our species. The evidence of Mesolithic Britain that archaeology has recovered is fragmentary, but consistently astonishing. At Starcar in North Yorkshire, a site preserved in the peat of what was once a lakeshore environment, excavations have revealed a community living around 9,000 BCE in ways that demand a complete rethinking of what primitive means in the context of human prehistory. The people of Starcar made headdresses from the skulls of red deer, carefully perforating the bone to reduce weight so the crown could be worn. Whether for ritual, for hunting camouflage, or for both, the object itself represents a level of intentional craft, symbolic thinking, and purposeful manufacture that puts them squarely in the same cognitive universe as any craftsperson working today. They made barbed points from antler, weapons engineered with specific aerodynamic properties for specific hunting applications. They returned to the same site over a period of hundreds of years, which means they had territorial concepts, seasonal movement patterns, and a relationship with specific places in the landscape that was transmitted from one generation to the next as living cultural knowledge. At Howick in Northumberland, there is the footprint of a circular structure dating to approximately 7,700 BCE, one of the earliest known permanent or semi-permanent buildings in Britain. Not a cave, not a rough windbreak, a structure planned, built, maintained, returned to. These are the people who, given time and the right conditions, would produce Stonehenge. Not because they were magical or chosen or guided by forces outside themselves, but because they were intelligent, curious, persistent, and given thousands of years of unbroken engagement with a landscape that rewarded careful observation and punished ignorance. Britain was their laboratory, and they had been working in it for a very long time before anyone else arrived. Around 4000 BCE, Britain received visitors. They came from across the Channel. Farming communities from continental Europe, themselves the descendants of agricultural migrants who had spread westward from Anatolia in what is now Turkey, across the Mediterranean and up through the river valleys of Central Europe over the previous 3,000 years. They brought with them cattle, sheep, wheat, barley, pottery, and a completely different relationship with the land than the hunter-gatherers who were already there. What happened next is one of the most debated and most significant transitions in the entire history of the British Isles. And modern genetic science has given us tools to understand it that previous generations of archaeologists could only dream about. In most of Europe, the story of the Neolithic transition, the shift from hunting and gathering to farming, is essentially a story of replacement. The incoming farmers, who carried a genetic signature derived from Anatolian populations, largely displaced the indigenous hunter-gatherers, not necessarily through violence, though violence certainly occurred. More often through the demographic arithmetic of agricultural productivity, farming communities could support significantly higher population densities than hunter-gatherer bands, and over centuries, the math simply overwhelmed the original inhabitants. But in Britain, the ancient DNA evidence tells a more complex and more interesting story. The result was a civilization with the organizational capacity to mobilize large-scale collective labor and the deep indigenous knowledge of the landscape to know where that labor should be directed. There was mixing, genuine, substantial, multi-generational mixing between the incoming Neolithic farmers and the indigenous Mesolithic British population. The genetic signature of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, those survivors of Doggerland who had been on this island for thousands of years, persisted in the Neolithic British population at levels significantly higher than in most continental European Neolithic populations. What this means, translated out of the language of population genetics into plain English, is this. The first farmers and the first Britons did not simply replace each other. They met, they lived alongside each other, they intermarried, they exchanged knowledge and stories and ways of understanding the world, and the civilization that emerged from that encounter was something genuinely new, a synthesis that carried within it the accumulated environmental knowledge of thousands of years of island habitation, fused with the agricultural technologies and social, organizational capacities of the incoming farmers. This fusion is the key to everything that followed, because the Mesolithic Britons brought to the encounter something that the incoming farmers, despite their technological advantages, did not have: a relationship with this specific landscape, with its rivers, its hills, its seasonal patterns, its sacred places, with the memory of the drowned world that had existed before the sea swallowed Doggerland, with the stories and rituals and territorial attachments that had been accumulating and deepening through every generation that had called Britain home. The incoming farmers arrived with the capacity to produce agricultural surplus, to support larger settled populations, and to organize collective labor on scales that hunter-gatherer bands could not match. But they arrived as strangers in a landscape they did not yet understand. The indigenous population, by contrast, had a map in their heads. Not just a geographical map, but a semantic map. They knew which places were powerful, which springs were sacred, which hilltops oriented to which horizon events, which locations in the landscape had been gathering places, ritual centers, burial grounds for their ancestors going back into a time before memory became story and story became myth. When the two groups merged, genetically, culturally, socially, the result was a civilization with both the organizational capacity to mobilize large-scale collective labor and the deep indigenous knowledge of the landscape to know where that labor should be directed. The result was the megalithic tradition. The long barrows, the stone circles, the henges, the cursus monuments, the sacred landscapes that transformed the hills and downs of Britain into the most spectacular and most deliberately constructed ceremonial geography in the prehistoric world. What the Neolithic farmers and the indigenous Mesolithic Britons built together was not just a collection of impressive structures. It was an entire civilizational project, sustained across more than 2,000 years, devoted to a single, overarching purpose, making permanent, in stone and earth, the relationship between the human community and the cosmic order it inhabited. And to understand what that relationship looked like, what it meant, what it required, what it achieved, we need to look at what they actually built. Starting with the structures that have received the least attention, but are, in many ways, the most revealing of all. We need to start with the dead. The British countryside contains thousands of long barrows. Most people drive past them without knowing what they are. Low, elongated mounds of earth or stone on hilltops and ridgelines, grass-covered, apparently featureless, looking from a distance like nothing more than a natural undulation in the landscape. They are not natural. They are the oldest deliberately constructed monuments in Britain, built between roughly 3,800 and 3,400 BCE, and they represent a relationship with death and with the dead that is so profoundly different from anything in the modern world that it is difficult to think about clearly without first setting aside most of our assumptions about what a burial is for. West Kennet Long Barrow in Wiltshire is one of the largest and best preserved of these structures. It sits on a ridge in the Avebury landscape, visible for miles across the chalk downland. It is roughly 100 meters long, a vast, deliberately shaped mound of chalk and earth with a stone-lined burial chamber at its eastern end, entered through a facade of massive standing stones that were arranged to frame and monumentalize the approach. West Kennet was built around 3,650 BCE. It was used, actively, continuously used, for burials and rituals for over 1,000 years before it was finally sealed around 2,500 BCE. Let that number sit for a moment. 1,000 years of continuous use. We stand in the present moment, and 1,000 years ago takes us back to 1024 CEE, before the Norman conquest of England, before the Magna Carta, before the Black Death, before the Renaissance, before the Reformation, before the entire period of English history that most people think of when they hear the word medieval. The people who sealed West Kennet Long Barrow were as distant from its builders as we are from the age of William the Conqueror. The bones in the Long Barrows were not remains, they were presences, and across that entire span, generation after generation returned to this place, not to deposit new bodies and leave, to manage the dead, to rearrange the bones, to sort them, organize them, separate skulls from long bones, remove certain remains and return others, interweave the skeletal material of different individuals until it was impossible to tell where one person ended and another began. This was not neglect or disrespect. It was the opposite. It was an extraordinarily active, sustained, intentional relationship with the ancestral community, one in which the boundary between the living and the dead was understood not as a final separation, but as a permeable membrane that required ongoing negotiation and maintenance. The bones in the Long Barrows were not remains. They were presences. They were community members of a different order, whose accumulated experience and whose ongoing relationship with the sacred geography of the landscape made them essential participants in the ritual life of the living community. You consulted them. You rearranged them. You brought them out, we think, for certain ceremonies, and then returned them. You added new members to their company. You maintained the physical structure that housed them across generations, repairing the stonework, clearing the entrance, keeping the access open. The institutional memory required to sustain this practice across 1,000 years is staggering to contemplate. Think about what you know of your own family history. How far back can you go with any confidence? 4 generations. 5. Maybe 6, if you have unusually diligent ancestors who left written records. The people who managed West Kennet Long Barrow maintained an active relationship with their ancestral dead across 40 or 50 generations without writing, without any medium of transmission except the living memory of trained minds and the physical presence of the monument itself. This is not primitive behavior. This is a sophisticated cultural system for maintaining communal identity and collective memory across timescales that most modern institutions cannot match. The Catholic Church, the world's oldest continuously functioning institution, is approximately 2,000 years old. The tradition of active ancestral engagement encoded in the British Long Barrow tradition was already 1,000 years old before the last stone at Stonehenge was placed. The Long Barrows also reveal something important about the social organization of the communities that built them. They are collective burial monuments, not individual tombs for kings or heroes, but houses for the community dead, where the bones of men, women, and children were mixed together without apparent hierarchy. The dominant social logic is not the celebration of individual greatness, but the maintenance of communal continuity. What matters is not who you were, but that you are part of us, and that we remember and honor our connection to you. Across the British Neolithic landscape, the Long Barrow tradition represents the foundational layer of what would become the most spectacular, monumental tradition in the prehistoric world. They are the roots. And from those roots grew something that still stops people in their tracks 5,000 years after it was built. But the long barrows were only the beginning. Something was coming that would dwarf them in ambition, in scale, and in the sheer audacity of what it proposed to achieve. Something that would require moving mountains. Literally. In 1973, a NASA engineer named Alexander Thom published a paper in the Journal for the History of Astronomy. Thom was not an archaeologist. He was a professor of engineering at Oxford, and he had spent decades conducting precise trigonometric surveys of stone circles and megalithic alignments across Britain and Ireland. His conclusion was methodical, cautious, and, to the mainstream archaeological establishment of the time, deeply uncomfortable. The builders of the British megalithic monuments had used a standardized unit of measurement. He called it the megalithic yard, approximately 2.72 feet or 0.829 meters. And he found evidence for its use across hundreds of sites, from the tip of Cornwall to the northern islands of Orkney. The debate over Thom's megalithic yard has continued for 5 decades and has not been fully resolved. But the debate itself reveals something important. The precision of the megalithic monuments is not in question. What is in question is only the mechanism by which that precision was achieved and coordinated across enormous distances, because the precision is undeniable, and the scale of what was achieved with that precision is, if you allow yourself to actually confront it, one of the most startling things in the entire archaeological record of our species. Let us start with Stonehenge. Not with the postcard image, but with the engineering problem. Around 2500 BCE, someone made a decision. The decision was to transport approximately 80 standing stones, each weighing between 2 and 4 metric tons, from the Pre-Celtic hills in southwest Wales to a location on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire. The straight line distance between those 2 points is approximately 150 miles. But no route through the Neolithic landscape of Britain is a straight line. Accounting for rivers, tidal estuaries, bogs, and the topography of the intervening terrain, the actual transport route for the bluestones almost certainly exceeded 250 miles. No wheeled vehicles, no draft animals capable of pulling multi-ton loads over uneven ground. No cranes, no pulleys, no metal tools. Just wood, rope, human bodies, and an organizational system capable of coordinating potentially thousands of workers over a period of years or decades to accomplish a single, specific, enormously difficult task. The logistics of this operation are genuinely staggering when you work through them in detail. Moving a 4-ton stone on wooden rollers over flat terrain requires approximately 200 people maintaining continuous coordinated pressure. Over uneven ground, the number increases and the difficulty multiplies. Crossing a river or tidal estuary requires either a raft capable of supporting the weight, itself a significant engineering project, or a detour that may add tens of miles to the journey. Who was coordinating all of this? The standard narrative of Neolithic Britain as a world of small, isolated farming villages simply cannot account for the organizational infrastructure required to move 80 stones over 250 miles. This is a state-level operation, or something very close to it. There must have been authority capable of commanding labor across tribal boundaries. There must have been communication networks capable of coordinating workers separated by dozens of miles. There must have been logistical systems capable of supplying food, water, and equipment to a mobile workforce over a period of years. None of these things are supposed to exist in Neolithic Britain, and yet the stones arrived. But the bluestones are merely the opening act. The real engineering showstopper arrives with the sarsen stones. The great trilithons, the iconic paired uprights topped by horizontal lintels that define the inner horseshoe of Stonehenge, are made from sarsen sandstone, a dense, extraordinarily hard, silicious rock found naturally at Marlborough Downs, approximately 25 miles to the north. The largest of these stones weighs approximately 25 metric tons. 25 tons. That is heavier than 4 adult African elephants. Moving one of these stones with Neolithic technology requires a workforce of several hundred people working in precise coordination, managing the stone's momentum on inclines, preventing it from veering off course or crushing the workers managing its trajectory. But the transport is only the beginning of the engineering story. Once the sarsen stones arrived at Stonehenge, they were finished, dressed, shaped with deliberate precision, using nothing but stone tools. Hammerstones pounded against the surface of the sarsen to knock away the rough natural crust and expose a smoother underlying surface. Stonehenge is not a miracle. It is a graduation. The outer face of the lintels at Stonehenge is not flat. It is curved, precisely curved to follow the arc of the circle, so that the completed outer ring of lintels forms a perfect arc rather than a series of flat-faced segments. Someone calculated the required curvature. Someone specified it to the workers finishing each individual lintel. Someone checked the finished work against the specification. This is not rough work. This is precision manufacturing at monumental scale. And then there are the joints. The lintels at Stonehenge do not simply rest on top of the uprights. They are locked to them using mortise and tenon joints, the same joinery technique used by carpenters working in wood. The tops of the upright stones were shaped into projecting tenons. Corresponding mortise holes were cut into the undersides of the lintels. When the lintels were raised and placed, itself a massive engineering operation, the tenons slid into the mortises and locked them in place against horizontal displacement. Adjacent lintels are joined to each other using tongue and groove joints. The entire outer ring of Stonehenge is not a series of independent elements. It is an interlocked structural system, engineered with the logic of carpentry, executed in stone. A material that weighs approximately 2.3 metric tons per cubic meter, that cannot be bent or shaped by hand, that must be worked with hours or days of labor for every inch of material removed. And the people building Stonehenge treated it like wood. They applied the joinery logic of the timber tradition to a medium that is approximately 3,000 times heavier and 1,000 times harder to shape. This is not supposed to exist. Not at this date, not in this place, not with these tools. And yet it exists. You can go and see it. You can put your hands on the tenons. You can measure the mortise holes. The engineering is there, 5,000 years old, standing in the English rain, waiting for anyone with the curiosity to look at it and ask the obvious question: how did they know how to do this? The answer: The only answer that the evidence actually supports is that they had been doing it for a long time before Stonehenge. That the tradition of precision stonework represented at Stonehenge was not invented at Stonehenge. It was the culmination of a long developmental trajectory that had begun with the shaping of orthostats for the earliest long barrows, had progressed through the construction of increasingly sophisticated passage tombs and stone circles, and had reached its apex at Stonehenge in the period around 2500 BCE. Stonehenge is not a miracle, it is a graduation. Now, Avebury. Avebury is the monument that John Aubrey, the 17th century English antiquarian, who was the first to document both Stonehenge and Avebury systematically, correctly identified as more significant than Stonehenge, at a time when Stonehenge already had all the cultural prestige. Aubrey was right, and the modern archaeological consensus has caught up with him. The main henge at Avebury is the largest stone circle in the world. Its outer ditch and bank enclose approximately 28 acres, an area large enough to contain the entire village of Avebury, which sits inside it today with room to spare. The outer bank was originally approximately 17 feet high. The ditch inside it, dug not on the outside of the bank, as defensive engineering would logically dictate, but on the inside, which tells you immediately that this was never a defensive structure, was excavated to a depth of approximately 30 feet into solid chalk bedrock. The volume of chalk removed in digging the Avebury ditch is estimated at approximately 200,000 cubic meters. All of it was moved using antler picks and ox shoulder blade shovels. No metal, no wheels, just the coordinated application of enormous quantities of human labor directed toward a single purpose across what must have been years of sustained effort. The scale of this achievement is one of those things that is genuinely impossible to appreciate from a distance. You have to stand at the bottom of the Avebury ditch, now significantly reduced by centuries of erosion and agricultural infilling, but still impressive, and look up at the bank rising above you to begin to feel what it meant in human terms. And Avebury is not a single monument. It is the anchor point of an entire ceremonial landscape that extends for miles in every direction. The West Kennet Avenue, a processional route of paired standing stones, leads south from the henge for approximately 1.5 miles to a timber and stone monument called the Sanctuary. The Beckhampton Avenue leads west. Silbury Hill, the largest prehistoric mound in Europe, an almost perfectly conical artificial hill rising 130 feet above the surrounding landscape and covering 5 acres, sits less than a mile to the south, its purpose still entirely unknown after 250 years of investigation. This is a planned landscape, a deliberately engineered sacred geography encompassing miles of countryside organized around astronomical relationships and topographical view lines, developed and elaborated over more than 1,000 years by communities who understood it as a unified whole. The people who built and used the Avebury landscape did not see a collection of independent structures. They saw a single, integrated system of meaning, a physical map of the cosmic order as they understood it, written into the landscape in a medium so durable that it has survived 5 millennia of weather, conquest, and agricultural pressure. They were not building temples. They were building a world. On the morning of the summer solstice, the sun rises on the northeastern horizon, and from the center of Stonehenge, its first light falls directly along the axis of the monument, through the gap between the slaughter stone and the heel stone, into the inner sanctum of the Great Trilithon Circle. This is not a coincidence. The orientation of Stonehenge's principal axis to the summer solstice sunrise, and by extension to the winter solstice sunset on the opposite bearing, was deliberate, planned, and executed with a precision that modern surveying confirms was achieved to within less than a degree of accuracy. But this is the part most people know. The part they do not know, the part that changes the entire character of what we are looking at, is what it took to achieve that alignment. You cannot simply look at the horizon on a solstice morning and decide where to build your monument. The horizon is not the same as the sky. The point at which the sun appears to rise on a solstice morning is specific to the exact latitude and longitude of your observation point, and it shifts slowly over long periods due to the gradual change in the obliquity of Earth's axial tilt. To build a monument aligned to the solstice at a specific location, you need to observe the solstice sunrise from that exact location across multiple years, tracking the precise point of first light against a fixed reference. You need a system for recording those observations. You need a method for translating the observed bearing into an architectural specification. And you need the engineering skill to build a structure that achieves that specification across the full width of a monument, encompassing the area of several football fields. This is sustained scientific practice. It is not superstition. It is not guesswork. It is the careful, methodical, multi-generational accumulation of empirical astronomical knowledge, refined and applied with deliberate precision. But Stonehenge is only the most famous example. To understand the true depth of the astronomical tradition embedded in the British megalithic civilization, you need to travel north. Far north. The Outer Hebrides, a chain of islands off the northwest coast of Scotland, exposed to the full force of the North Atlantic, swept by winds that feel in winter as if they originated in the Arctic, which some of them did. The island of Lewis, and on a promontory above a sea loch, surrounded by the flat, boggy expanse of the Hebridean moor, a monument called Calanaeus. Calanaeus stands today as it has stood for approximately 5,000 years, a central monolith over 13 feet tall, surrounded by a rough circle of 13 standing stones, approached from the north by a double avenue of stones approximately 270 feet long, and flanked by shorter stone rows extending to the east, west, and south. The overall arrangement, viewed from above, resembles a cross or a keyhole, a unique design among the stone circles of Britain that was clearly not accidental. The stones are of Louisian gneiss, one of the oldest exposed rock surfaces on the face of the Earth, formed approximately 3 billion years ago. They were erected around 2900 BCE, making Calanaeus contemporary with the earliest phases of Stonehenge. The astronomical significance of Calanaeus is not the solstice. It is something more obscure, more complex, and, when you understand what it required, more astonishing. This is science, not proto-science, not a pale approximation of science. Science, The Moon has a cycle within its cycle. Every 27 days, the Moon completes one orbit of the Earth. But the plane of that orbit is tilted relative to the plane of Earth's orbit around the Sun, and that tilt precesses, wobbles, on a cycle of approximately 18.6 years. The result is that over the course of 18.6 years, the Moon's rising and setting points on the horizon trace a slow oscillation between extreme northern and extreme southern positions. At the extremes of this cycle, what astronomers call the major lunar standstill, the Moon rises and sets at points on the horizon far beyond its usual range. At Calais, at the latitude of the Isle of Lewis, the major lunar standstill produces a phenomenon that occurs nowhere else on Earth in quite the same way. When the Moon reaches its extreme southern declination in the 18.6-year cycle, it rises very low above the hills to the south, so low that it appears to graze the ridgeline. And from Calais, from the precise position of the central monolith, the geometry of the site is arranged so that the Moon, at this extreme declination, appears to walk along the horizon ridge and then enter the stone circle from the South Avenue. To design and build a monument oriented to this event requires knowing in advance where the Moon will rise at the extreme of its 18.6-year cycle, not the ordinary monthly moonrise, but the extreme declination that occurs only once every 18 to 19 years. You cannot observe this event once and design a monument for it. You need to observe it multiple times, across multiple standstill cycles, separated by nearly 2 decades each, to establish the precise horizon bearing with the accuracy required for architectural expression. Nay, at minimum, the tradition of astronomical observation that produced Calais required sustained, systematic skywatching across a period of at least 50 to 60 years, almost certainly much longer. The development of a method for predicting when the next standstill would occur. The calculation of the geometry required to produce the alignment. The engineering of the monument itself. This is science, not proto-science, not a pale approximation of science. Science, the systematic empirical investigation of natural phenomena, the development of predictive models based on observed patterns, and the technological application of those models to real-world problems. It was being practiced on the Isle of Lewis 5,000 years ago. Now consider what this implies about the people doing it. Sustained astronomical observation across multiple 18.6-year cycles means institutional continuity across human lifetimes. No individual lives long enough to personally observe multiple complete standstill cycles and retain the detailed records necessary to establish the pattern. This knowledge had to be transmitted from one generation to the next, with sufficient precision to preserve the critical details across the gap between observations. The astronomical knowledge embedded in the British megalithic tradition was not the inspiration of a single genius. It was the product of an institutional tradition of systematic observation, record-keeping, and knowledge transmission that operated across generations. In the absence of writing, that institution was the human mind. Trained, disciplined minds carrying in their memories the accumulated astronomical record of their predecessors and transmitting it, with additions and refinements, to their successors. This is the tradition that the Romans encountered. Not stone circles left by forgotten people, but a living, active, intellectually serious tradition of systematic inquiry into the nature of the cosmos, practiced by specialists whose training was so rigorous and so thorough that Julius Caesar felt compelled to note, even in a document designed to minimize and marginalize the people he was conquering, that their intellectual preparation required 20 years of intensive study. 20 years, the training period of a druid, the living inheritor of the megalithic astronomical tradition, was 20 years of committed memorization and practice. A modern PhD takes 4 to 6 years, a medical degree 8 to 10. The intellectual tradition that produced the alignments at Calais and Newgrange required twice as long as a medical education to transmit to each new generation. And the knowledge they were transmitting was not primitive. It was the accumulated astronomical, philosophical, legal, historical, and ecological science of a civilization that had been developing and refining that knowledge for longer than Rome had existed. At Newgrange in County Meath, Ireland, built around 3200 BCE, making it older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids at Giza, the builders engineered a precisely calibrated light box above the main entrance of a cruciform passage tomb. On the mornings around the winter solstice, the rising sun sends a shaft of light through this box, down a passage 19 meters long, and into the inner chamber, illuminating the floor for approximately 17 minutes. To engineer this feature, the builders had to know, before the roof was in place, before the entrance was finished, before the monument was complete, exactly where the winter solstice sun would rise on the horizon at the precise latitude of the monument. They had to translate that observed bearing into an architectural angle, and they had to set the light box aperture to that angle without any possibility of adjustment after the fact. They got it right. After 5,000 years, the light still enters. The alignment still works. This is the civilization the Romans walked into. This is what was waiting for them when they crossed the Channel. Not barbarism, not ignorance, not superstition. An ancient, sophisticated, scientifically literate tradition of human inquiry, expressed not in books, but in stone, not in treatises, but in alignments, not in universities, but in the trained memories of specialist practitioners who had been carrying and refining this knowledge since before Rome was a dream. In 2018, a landmark paper published in the journal Nature transformed our understanding of the demographic history of prehistoric Britain. The researchers, led by David Reich at Harvard Medical School, and a team of ancient DNA specialists from institutions across Europe, had analyzed genetic material from hundreds of ancient British skeletons spanning the period from before the Neolithic to the end of the Bronze Age. Their conclusion was stark, dramatic, and deeply puzzling. In the space of a few centuries around 2500 BCE, the population of Britain was replaced, not supplemented, not mixed with, replaced at a level that the researchers estimated at approximately 90%. The incoming population arrived with a cultural tradition known as the bell beaker phenomenon, named for the distinctive inverted bell-shaped pottery vessels that appear across Europe from the Iberian Peninsula to the Baltic coast in the period roughly between 2800 and 1800 BCE. The Bell-Beaker people were ultimately derived from the Yamnaya, nomadic pastoralists of the Pontic steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea, who had themselves exploded westward across Europe in the centuries around 3000 BCE, spreading Indo-European languages and a set of genetic markers that now appear in the majority of modern Europeans. By the time the Bell-Beaker tradition reached Britain, it was a complex cultural mix. Yamnaya-derived genetics combined with Neolithic farmer ancestry from Central Europe, carrying with them a new suite of technologies, including copper metallurgy, a distinctive archery tradition evidenced by stone wrist guards and flint arrowheads, and a dramatically different approach to burial, emphasizing individual interment rather than the collective ancestral chambers of the Neolithic long barrows. In genetic terms, the people who finished building Stonehenge were almost entirely different from the people who started it. The genetic signature of the builders of the early phases, those hybrid descendants of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and Neolithic farmers who had developed the long barrow tradition, who had organized the bluestone transport from Wales, who had first conceived the idea of a monument aligning with the solstice sun on Salisbury Plain, almost vanished from the British gene pool within a few centuries. Almost, but not entirely. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange. The Bell-Beaker people who arrived in Britain did not destroy Stonehenge. They did not fill in the Avebury ditch. They did not dismantle the long barrows or desecrate the communal burial chambers of the people they were, in genetic terms, replacing. What survived was not blood. What survived was the landscape. They continued to use the monuments. They added to them. They incorporated the existing sacred landscape into their own ritual practices with what appears, from the archaeological evidence, to have been deep respect, even reverence. The Sarsen phase of Stonehenge, the construction of the great trilithons, the largest and most technically demanding phase of the monument's development, was undertaken precisely during the period of maximum Bell-Beaker demographic dominance in Britain. The people building the most impressive stone circle in the world were, in genetic terms, largely not the descendants of the people who had conceived and begun it. Why? Why would a population that had just achieved what amounts to a demographic takeover of an island dedicate enormous collective resources to completing and elaborating a monument that was designed and begun by the people they had replaced? The most intellectually honest answer is that we do not fully know. But the evidence suggests several contributing factors, each of which tells us something important about the nature of the civilization these monuments represented. First, the monuments themselves were so obviously impressive that they commanded respect from anyone who encountered them, regardless of cultural background. Stonehenge in 2500 BCE was already a significant structure. The bluestone circle had been standing for generations. Arriving in a new landscape and finding a monument of this scale already there would not have felt like encountering a primitive ruin. It would have felt like encountering evidence of power. Second, the Bell-Beaker transition was not a single catastrophic event, but a process unfolding over centuries. During that process, there was almost certainly sustained cultural contact between the incoming and indigenous populations. The specialist classes of the existing civilization, the people who held the astronomical knowledge, the ritual traditions, The understanding of what the monuments were for and how to use them were not necessarily among the first casualties of demographic transition. Their knowledge was too valuable. The bell beaker communities that were settling into the British landscape needed someone who could tell them where the solstice sun rose, what the standing stones meant, and what rituals needed to be performed and when. Third, and perhaps most profoundly, the landscape itself was the argument. You cannot stand at Stonehenge and conclude that the people who built it were ignorant. The engineering is the proof. The astronomy is the proof. The sheer scale and deliberateness of the Avebury complex is the proof. The incoming bell beaker communities were encountering physical evidence, written in stone across the entire British landscape, that the people who had been here before them possessed knowledge and organizational capacity of a genuinely impressive order. The Amesbury Archer, discovered in 2002 near Stonehenge and dated to approximately 2300 BCE, offers a window into this transitional moment. His grave, the richest bell beaker burial found anywhere in Europe, contained over 100 objects: copper knives, gold hair ornaments, flint tools of exceptional quality, pottery vessels, and arrowheads. Isotope analysis of his teeth showed that he had grown up in the Alpine region of Central Europe. He had traveled over 1,000 miles to reach Britain. He was buried near Stonehenge, not randomly, not by coincidence. His proximity to the monument suggests a deliberate, meaningful relationship, possibly that of a specialist craftsman or metalworker who had sought out the most sacred location in the British landscape as the place where his life and his prestige would be commemorated. He was a foreigner in Britain, and yet he was buried in the shadow of a monument built by the people his own people had demographically displaced. This is the paradox of the bell beaker transition, and it is one that the conventional narrative of prehistoric Britain, which treats cultural change as following demographic change in a straightforward sequence, cannot adequately explain. The cultural logic of the megalithic tradition survived the genetic replacement of the people who had developed it. The monuments were more durable than the populations who built them, and the astronomical, ceremonial, and philosophical knowledge embedded in those monuments was transmitted imperfectly, incompletely, but persistently to the incoming population that had, in genetic terms, almost entirely replaced its predecessors. What survived was not blood. What survived was the landscape, and the knowledge of how to read it. Julius Caesar was not a man who was easily impressed. He had met Cleopatra. He had conquered Gaul. He had crushed the most formidable military forces that the Celtic world could muster, from the Rhine to the Pyrenees, in a campaign of extraordinary speed, brutality, and strategic brilliance. He was not the kind of person who overstated the capabilities of his adversaries in official documents, quite the opposite. And yet, in his account of the Gallic Wars, writing about the Druids of Britain and Gaul, Caesar felt compelled to note something that sat awkwardly with his overall narrative of Roman civilization, civilizing barbarian chaos. The Druids spent 20 years memorizing a body of knowledge so vast and so complex that no amount of time seemed excessive for the task. 20 years. Caesar mentions this as if it is a curiosity, an odd cultural practice, perhaps admirable in its discipline, but ultimately inferior to the Roman preference for writing things down. He notes that the Druids deliberately refused to commit their learning to writing, speculating that this was to prevent the knowledge from becoming common property, or to preserve the mental discipline of memorization. Caesar was a sophisticated man, but he was missing something fundamental. The Druids did not refuse to write their knowledge down because they were suspicious of literacy or protective of their monopoly on information. They refused because writing would have destroyed the knowledge, not metaphorically. Literally, the knowledge they were transmitting was not the kind of knowledge that survives translation into text. Consider what a trained Druid actually knew. According to the various Roman sources that describe the tradition, Caesar, Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, Pomponius Mela, the Druidic curriculum encompassed the motion of the stars and planets, the size and shape of the world, the powers of the gods and the nature of the soul, the transmission of consciousness after death, the cycles of time and the patterns of history, the legal traditions of the Celtic tribal world, the genealogies of ruling families, the medical properties of plants and animals, and what Caesar somewhat vaguely calls the nature of things. This is a comprehensive description of a total intellectual culture, not a specialization, not a single discipline, but the integrated framework through which an entire civilization understood its relationship with the natural and cosmic order. And crucially, most of it is knowledge that cannot be adequately captured in written propositions. The Druids did not refuse to write their knowledge down because they were suspicious of literacy. They refused because writing would have destroyed the knowledge. How do you write down, in a form that actually transmits the knowledge, what it means to read a landscape? To know, from the way the wind moves through a particular stand of trees, that a storm is coming from the northwest in approximately 3 hours. To recognize, from the behavior of specific bird species at a particular lakeshore, that the salmon are running in the river a mile to the east. To understand, from the quality of light at a specific horizon, combined with the angle of shadows at a megalithic monument and the current position of the moon, that a particular seasonal ritual needs to be performed within the next 48 hours. These are not facts that can be written in a book and recovered from the text by a future reader. They are skills, embodied, practiced, integrated capacities for reading the natural world that exist only in the nervous system of a person who has spent years developing them in specific landscapes under the supervision of someone who already possesses them. The Druidic tradition of 20-year oral training was not an inefficient substitute for writing. It was the only adequate medium for transmitting the kind of knowledge it was transmitting. The training worked by creating, in the body and mind of the student, the same integrated capacity for landscape reading, astronomical tracking, ritual practice, and philosophical reasoning that existed in the body and mind of the teacher. You could not shortcut this process with a text any more than you can learn to ride a bicycle by reading a manual. And this is why the Druidic tradition was simultaneously the most sophisticated intellectual institution in pre-Roman Britain and the most vulnerable to Roman suppression. Because it existed nowhere except in the trained bodies of living practitioners, its destruction required only the systematic elimination of those practitioners, which is exactly what the Romans eventually attempted. But before we get to the massacre, it is worth lingering on the content of what the Druids knew, and specifically on the connection between their knowledge and the monuments that had been standing on the British landscape for 2,000 years before they were born. The astronomical knowledge that produced the alignments at Stonehenge and Calanaeus and Newgrange did not vanish when those monuments were built. It continued to be observed, refined, and transmitted by the specialist class that maintained the ritual traditions associated with the monuments. The 18.6-year lunar cycle encoded at Calanaeus is precisely the Metonic cycle that Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, drawing on sources that included the account of the Greek explorer Pytheas, describes as the basis for the circular temple of great size on a northern island that the sun god visits every 19 years. The people Diodorus was drawing on knew that Stonehenge, or whatever monument he was actually describing, had a connection to a 19-year astronomical cycle. They recorded it, which means that as late as approximately 320 BCE, the astronomical significance of the British megalithic monuments was not forgotten. It was part of a living intellectual tradition, actively maintained and understood by practitioners who could explain it to a visiting Greek explorer. The Druidic tradition was not a new invention of the Iron Age. It was the latest form of an institutional practice of knowledge transmission that stretched back, unbroken, to the builders of the monuments themselves. The 20-year training period of a Druid in 100 BCE was the living continuation of the same intellectual tradition that had required a similarly intensive period of training to produce the astronomers and engineers who built Newgrange in 3200 BCE. Consider the length of that chain. From the construction of Newgrange to the Roman conquest of Britain is approximately 3,000 years. 3,000 years of unbroken institutional transmission, carrying forward the accumulated astronomical, ecological, philosophical, and historical knowledge of a civilization that had been developing on the British Isles since the first survivors of the Doggerland flood climbed to higher ground. This is what the Romans were dealing with. Not a primitive tribal society maintaining superstitious practices around incomprehensible ancient ruins. An ancient, sophisticated, living intellectual tradition, older than Rome, in many respects more nuanced than anything Rome had produced, still active, still developing, still transmitting its accumulated knowledge to new generations through the only medium adequate to the task: the trained human mind. When Julius Caesar crossed the Channel in 55 BCE, he found something he was not prepared for. He found ruins he could not explain, earthworks and stone circles visible from the march routes of his legions, larger in scale than anything in the Roman world that had been built without the benefit of professional military engineering or state-organized labor. He found a local population that treated these structures not as ancient curiosities, but as active sacred sites, integrated into the ritual and social life of the communities living around them. And he found a priestly class, the Druids, who appeared to function as the intellectual backbone of the entire society, simultaneously serving as priests, judges, historians, astronomers, philosophers, and the living memory of a civilization. Caesar, being Caesar, processed all of this through the lens of military strategy. The Druids were dangerous not primarily because of their knowledge, but because of their organizational reach. They operated across tribal boundaries, moving freely between the various Celtic tribal polities of Britain and Gaul, recognized by all as a neutral class with authority that superseded tribal politics. In a landscape where Rome's standard strategy of divide and conquer was the primary tool of imperial expansion, a class of individuals capable of unifying divided tribes around a shared intellectual and spiritual framework was a genuine military threat. But there is something else in Caesar's account, something he almost certainly processed at a level below his capacity to articulate it, which reveals a deeper discomfort. Caesar describes the interior of Britain as inhabited by people he calls the original inhabitants, suggesting his recognition that the coastal, more Romanized populations of the southeast were relative newcomers, while those in the interior represented a continuity of presence reaching back to a period that his sources could not specify. He notes that Britain is regarded by the Druids of Gaul as the source and center of their tradition, that Gallic Druids traveled to Britain for their most advanced training, as a modern scholar might travel to a great university for a postgraduate degree. He describes a society with numerous buildings, large cattle herds, and a population described as dense by the standards of the time. This does not match the image of the barbarian fringe that Roman political culture required for the justification of conquest. And crucially, he does not describe Stonehenge. This silence is one of the most significant omissions in ancient literature. Caesar's legions marched across the chalk downs of southern England. Stonehenge was there. Avebury was there. The entire ceremonial landscape of the Salisbury Plain was there, visible, massive, undeniable. Caesar, who was writing a detailed account of his military campaigns and the territories he traversed, makes no mention of any of it. Why? You do not spend the resources the Roman Empire spent on destroying a priesthood unless you understand that the priesthood is the civilization. The most politically convenient explanation, and political convenience drove much of what Caesar chose to record in the Gallic Wars, is that acknowledging the existence of monuments that dwarfed anything in the Roman world, built by people his audience expected to be primitive barbarians, would have been deeply, embarrassingly inconvenient. The Gallic Wars was not an ethnographic treatise. It was a political document designed to justify Caesar's campaigns, demonstrate his greatness, and build the case for the military and political rewards he expected upon his return to Rome. Acknowledging that the barbarian island he was conquering contained the physical evidence of a civilization more ancient than Rome, organized around intellectual traditions of genuine philosophical depth, would have undermined the entire narrative framework of the document. So, he left it out. But the discomfort leaked through in other ways, in other authors, in other texts. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, describes the circular temple on the northern island that the sun god visits every 19 years, a description that fits Stonehenge, or possibly Avebury, with the astronomical detail suggesting genuine knowledge of the monument's function. Pomponius Mela describes the Druids as teaching in hidden places and caves, a description that may preserve a memory of the use of passage tombs and megalithic chambers as spaces for the transmission of esoteric knowledge. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, calls the Druids magi, placing them in the same intellectual category as the Persian priestly scholars who were among the most respected intellectuals in the ancient world. These are not the descriptions of a primitive religious cult. They are the descriptions of an intellectual tradition that educated Romans found simultaneously impressive and troubling. Impressive because its learning was genuine, troubling because it existed in a form that Roman intellectual culture could not easily categorize or absorb. By the time the Roman conquest of Britain under Emperor Claudius began in 43 CE, the policy toward the Druidic tradition had already hardened into systematic suppression. The Emperor Tiberius had officially banned Druidic practice in 21 CE. The reasons were ostensibly religious. Human sacrifice was alleged, though the evidence is disputed and likely exaggerated by Roman propagandists. But the real reasons were political. The Druids were the memory keepers of Britain. They held in their trained minds the genealogies and legal traditions that gave legitimacy to tribal authority. They held the historical records that connected living communities to the deep past of the landscape. They held the astronomical knowledge that had produced the monuments and that continued to give those monuments their ritual function. And they held the philosophical framework through which the British population understood its own identity and its relationship with the land it inhabited. As long as the Druidic institution survived, an alternative framework of authority, identity, and meaning existed alongside the Roman one. The Roman administrative system could tax a population, garrison their territory, and build roads through their landscape. But it could not simply overwrite the deep structure of a civilization that had been forming for 3,000 years. It needed to destroy the institution that maintained and transmitted that deep structure. And this brings us back to the morning on the Menai Strait, 60 CE, the 14th Legion, the women with torches, and the robed figures with raised arms, and the Roman soldiers standing still. Tacitus, who was not present, but who is writing from the accounts of those who were, records the scene with details that feel genuine in the way that all truly strange things reported by skeptical observers feel genuine, because a Roman historian had no incentive to make the Roman legions look momentarily helpless unless they actually were. The soldiers crossed the water. They killed everyone they could find. They burned the sacred groves that had stood on the island of Mona, Anglesey, for longer than any of them could imagine. But they were not destroying a primitive religious practice. They were attempting to sever a chain of knowledge transmission that had been running, unbroken, for approximately 3,000 years. They understood this at some level. The deliberateness of the targeting, not just the warriors, but specifically the Druids, specifically the sacred groves, specifically the locations where the training and transmission of the tradition took place, reveals a military strategy shaped by a genuine understanding of what the Druidic institution represented. You do not spend the resources the Roman Empire spent on destroying a priesthood unless you understand that the priesthood is not primarily religious. You do it when you understand that the priesthood is the civilization, that eliminating the specialists who maintain and transmit the accumulated knowledge of the tradition is equivalent to destroying the tradition itself, without needing to tear down every stone circle in Britain, which was fortunate for the stones, because tearing down every stone circle in Britain would have been impossible. Rome won. In every conventional military and political sense, Rome won completely. Within a century of the Claudian invasion, the lowland zone of Britain was thoroughly Romanized. Roman towns had been built at Colchester, London, Bath, York, and dozens of other locations. Roman roads, those extraordinary dead-straight engineering achievements that still influence the road network of Britain today, crossed the landscape in every direction. Roman villas, with their underfloor heating and their mosaic floors and their careful geometry of garden and courtyard, dotted the agricultural hinterland of every major Roman settlement. The tribal aristocracies of Britain had been largely incorporated into the Roman administrative system. Their leaders bore Roman names, wore Roman clothes, spoke Latin in official contexts, and participated in the political and economic structures of the empire with varying degrees of enthusiasm and resistance. The temples of the Celtic gods had been rebuilt in Roman architectural style, the deities renamed and merged with Roman equivalents in the process of Interpretatio Romana, the standard Roman technique for managing the religious traditions of conquered peoples. And yet, in the tablets discovered at Vindolanda, the extraordinary collection of thin wooden writing tablets inscribed in Roman ink and preserved by the waterlogged conditions of the fort site near Hadrian's Wall, there is a letter from a Roman soldier that uses an unusual term. He refers to the local British population as Britunkuli, a diminutive. A slightly contemptuous term that translates roughly as the Little Britons, or in the idiom of the modern American equivalent, something like the locals. What is significant about this term is not its contempt. Roman soldiers were contemptuous of everyone who wasn't Roman. That was a structural feature of imperial military culture. What is significant is the implication of persistent distinctiveness. The Roman soldier writing this letter was stationed in Britain, surrounded by a population that had been under Roman administration for generations, and he still felt the need to designate them as a separate category, people who were identifiably, recognizably, persistently themselves, not fully absorbed into the Roman world despite decades of exposure to it. The Britunkuli kept their languages. Celtic languages, the ancestors of modern Welsh, and through the Irish branch, Scottish Gaelic and Irish, continued to be spoken throughout the Roman period by the majority of the British population. Latin was the language of administration, of commerce, of the urban elite. But in the rural landscape, in the farming communities, in the villages that continued to organize themselves around patterns of life that had been established long before Rome arrived, the old languages persisted. The sacred sites kept their power. This is perhaps the most telling evidence of the depth and resilience of the indigenous tradition. The spring at Bath, one of the largest sacred springs in Roman Britain, was venerated as a sacred site long before the Roman conquest. The deposits of votive objects found at the bottom of the spring include material dating to the Bronze Age and possibly earlier, representing a continuous tradition of sacred practice at the same location stretching back thousands of years before Claudius's legions crossed the Channel. The Romans, characteristically, did not destroy this sacred spring. They built a temple over it, the magnificent classical structure that became the Bath Complex, one of the finest Roman religious buildings in Britain. They renamed the deity. The local goddess Sulis became Sulis Minerva, co-opted into the Roman divine hierarchy by identification with a Roman equivalent. But the practice of throwing votive objects into the spring continued through the Roman period and beyond, with a persistence that demonstrates the limits of Roman administrative power over the deep structures of indigenous religious life. This pattern repeated itself across Britain. The hilltops and sacred groves, the ancient springs and river confluences, the landscape features that had been venerated since the Neolithic, they continued to attract ritual activity through the Roman period. Not always with Roman institutional approval, not always in forms the Roman religious authorities would have recognized. But persistently, stubbornly, generation after generation, the British population continued to orient itself around a sacred geography that was older than Rome, and that the Roman administration, for all its power, could not fully absorb or redirect. Stonehenge itself continued to be visited in the Roman period. Roman coins and pottery have been found at the site, evidence of continued human presence, possibly of pilgrimage or continued ritual significance, centuries after the monument was built and the civilization that built it had been, in genetic terms, largely replaced by successive waves of newcomers. The civilization that had terrified Rome was still there. Silbury Hill was incorporated into a Roman road network with a road running around its base, not through it, not over it, but around it. This is a significant detail. Roman road engineers were not sentimental. They routed their roads in straight lines whenever terrain permitted, and they were entirely willing to flatten obstacles that stood in their way. The decision to route the road around Silbury Hill rather than through it suggests that even Roman engineers, those most rational, most practically minded of ancient professionals, recognized that this particular obstacle was not one they were going to be allowed to remove. And beyond the southern frontier, in the parts of Britain that Rome never fully controlled, the Highland zone of Scotland, the islands of the north and west, the indigenous tradition continued with much less interruption. The Picts, who emerge in the historical record in the post-Roman period as the dominant culture of northern Britain, left behind a tradition of carved stone monuments bearing abstract symbols that remain among the most intriguing and least understood artifacts of the British archaeological record. Pictish symbols, the crescent and V-rod, the double disc, the mirror and comb symbol, and dozens of other complex geometric forms appear apparently fully formed in the 6th and 7th centuries CE, carved on standing stones across Scotland with a consistency of design and execution that suggests a well-established, long-practiced artistic tradition. They do not derive from Roman art. They do not derive from any known Celtic artistic tradition. They appear to be indigenous, deep-rooted, and connected through a long chain of development that the archaeological record has not yet fully reconstructed, to the abstract geometric tradition of the British Neolithic. The Pictish symbol tradition may be the last flowering of an artistic and symbolic vocabulary that began with the geometric decoration of Neolithic pottery and the carved spirals of the passage tombs, a visual language that had been developing and evolving for 5,000 years, finally finding its most sophisticated expression in the extraordinary carved stones of post-Roman Scotland. Rome left Britain in 410 CE, pulling its legions back to defend the crumbling continental empire against the pressure of the migrations that would eventually produce medieval Europe. The administrative, economic, and military structure of Roman Britain collapsed within a generation. The towns emptied, the villas fell into ruin, the road network slowly deteriorated under the pressure of traffic and weather and the absence of maintenance. But the stones stood, the earthworks endured, the sacred springs kept flowing, the landscape, that text written in earth and stone and astronomical alignment across thousands of years, remained legible to anyone willing to learn to read it. The civilization that had terrified Rome was still there, damaged, suppressed, partially overwritten by 4 centuries of Roman administration, but still there, in the Celtic languages that the rural population had never stopped speaking, in the sacred sites that had been venerated since before Rome was built, in the folk traditions and seasonal practices and landscape-based knowledge that the rural communities of Britain maintained through the Roman period and beyond, in the memory of the landscape itself, the long barrows on the ridge, the stone circles on the hilltop, the ancient springs at the valley bottom that organized the experience of living on this island into a system of meaning that no administrative overlay could permanently displace. And it endures still, imperfectly, fragmentarily, but recognizably. The next time you see Stonehenge, in an image, in a film, in the gray English rain, if you are lucky enough to stand there in person, try to see it not as a prehistoric curiosity, not as a tourist attraction, not as a backdrop for summer solstice celebrations. Try to see it as what it actually is, the most visible surviving expression of a civilization so old, so sophisticated, and so deeply rooted in the landscape of the British Isles that it survived everything the ancient world could throw at it. It survived the genetic replacement of its builders. It survived the political and demographic disruption of the Bronze Age. It survived 4 centuries of the most efficient imperial administrative machine the Western world had ever produced. It survived the suppression of the intellectual tradition that understood it best. It is still there. It is still aligned to the solstice sun. It is still, if you know how to read it, a text written in stone by people who understood the cosmos in ways we are only beginning to recover. The Romans looked at it and felt awe they could not afford to fully acknowledge. We are finally in a position to acknowledge it properly. Not because the evidence has changed. The evidence has been there all along, in the landscape, in the DNA of the British population, in the folk traditions and sacred sites and astronomical alignments that 5,000 years of human activity have deposited on this small island at the edge of the world. But because we are finally developing the intellectual honesty to look at it clearly, to see the civilization it represents for what it was: ancient, sophisticated, scientifically literate, philosophically serious, organizationally capable, and, in the most fundamental sense of that word, civilized. more civilized in many of the ways that actually matter than the empire that tried to erase it. The stones are still standing, the alignments still hold, and the civilization they represent, the civilization that was here before the Celts, before the Bell-Beaker migrants, before the Neolithic farmers, reaching back through the survivors of the Doggerland flood to the first human beings who ever set foot on this island, is still here too, written in the landscape, waiting to be read. The only question is whether we have the humility and the curiosity to learn the language. Every year, the picture grows richer. LiDAR surveys, using aircraft-mounted laser systems to create millimeter-precision maps of the ground surface, penetrating through vegetation and topsoil to reveal buried features invisible from the surface, continue to transform our understanding of the prehistoric British landscape. A survey of the Stonehenge environs published in 2014 revealed more than 60 previously unknown monuments within the immediate vicinity of the site, including the footprint of a massive timber structure that may have served as a viewing platform for rituals at the monument. The Ness of Brodgar, discovered in 2003 on the same strip of land between the two Orkney Lochs that connects the standing stones of Stennis to the Ring of Brodgar, continues to yield extraordinary results from ongoing excavations. The complex, a series of massive stone buildings within a walled enclosure, decorated with elaborate geometric designs and associated with evidence of feasting on a scale that implies gatherings from across a wide region, has been described by its excavators as potentially the most important Neolithic site in Europe. We do not yet know its full extent. We do not yet know what it was for. We are only beginning to understand what it means. Ancient DNA analysis is producing results faster than the interpretive frameworks can absorb them. New studies of ancient British genomes are revealing previously unsuspected population movements, contact events, and continuities that are rewriting the demographic history of the island in real time. The Sweet Track in Somerset, a raised wooden walkway built across the Somerset levels around 3800 BCE, among the earliest examples of wooden engineering in Britain, has been dated with extraordinary precision using tree ring analysis and radiocarbon dating. The results confirm that it was built in a single construction season, implying an organized labor force operating under coordinated direction. The timber species were specifically selected for their mechanical properties. The engineering was not improvised. At Must Farm in Cambridgeshire, the Bronze Age Pompeii, destroyed by fire around 850 BCE and preserved in astonishing completeness by the anaerobic mud of the Cambridgeshire Fens. Excavations completed in 2016 revealed a level of everyday material sophistication that demolished definitively any remaining credibility of the primitive, prehistoric Britain narrative. The inhabitants of Must Farm ate a varied, nutritious diet. They wore textiles of a quality comparable to modern hand-woven cloth. They used turned wooden bowls and platters. They owned glassware traded from continental workshops. They possessed bronze tools of considerable complexity and quality. Who built this? And what did they know that we have forgotten? These were not people on the edge of existence. These were people living well within a sophisticated material culture, connected to trade networks that extended across Europe, managing their wetland environment with accumulated expertise, producing objects of genuine craft quality. They were, in every sense that matters, civilized. The story of prehistoric Britain is not finished. We are not at its conclusion. We are somewhere in the middle, past the period when ignorance was entirely excusable, well short of the period when full understanding will be possible. Every new excavation opens questions faster than it answers them. Every new scientific technique reveals layers of complexity that earlier methods could not detect. What we can say, with confidence earned through a century of careful archaeological work and the extraordinary analytical tools that modern science has placed in the archaeologist's hands, is this: before the Romans arrived on the shores of Britain, before the Celts transformed its culture, before the Bell-Beaker migrants transformed its population, before the Neolithic farmers transformed its landscape, there were people here, people of intelligence, curiosity, organizational capacity, and scientific sophistication, people who looked at the sky and tracked its patterns for generations, who understood the land they lived on with a depth of knowledge that no subsequent population has matched, who built in stone the evidence of their understanding and their ambition. They built Stonehenge, they built Avebury, they built Newgrange and Callanace, and the Ring of Brodgar, and the Ness of Brodgar, and the Sweet Track, and the Long Barrows, and the hill forts, and the field systems, and the sacred sites that persist as holy places to this day. They built a civilization. And when the most powerful empire the Western world had produced looked at what they had built and felt, in spite of all their cultural conditioning against it, something they did not have adequate words for, it was awe. The honest awe of a civilization that was old when Rome was young, sophisticated when Rome was still learning, and persistent beyond anything that Rome could permanently suppress. The stones are still there. The alignments still hold. The civilization they represent is still here. In the landscape, in the language, in the folk traditions and sacred springs and seasonal rituals that 5 millennia of human habitation have written into the body of this island. It is waiting, as it always has been, for anyone willing to stop, look, and ask the question that changes everything. Who built this? And what did they know that we have forgotten?